So I recently reran an older episode about the Disco Demolition event from the mid-1970s. This is a semi-unscripted episode. We'll be seeing a lot of cuts here. I wanted to rerun that episode and also do a retake of this one because while I think the history in that episode holds up pretty well, I don't necessarily think that the take or grasp of history, contextualizing it, necessarily did in light of some other recent revisitations of the history of that era and moment. And as much as I pride myself as being somewhat ahead of my time or ahead of the curve on guessing meaningless movie bullshit that doesn't matter, in terms of, actual public events and sweep of history stuff that actually does matter and can make a difference, man, do I wish I was better at predicting how that was going to go, because I could probably do more good in the world. Kids, that's what they call a Cassandra complex. In any case, to rerun some clips from the episode just to bring everyone up to speed as to what that was about. The great cautionary tales of fandom gone wrong, or at least out of control. The short version is that on July 12, 1979, the promoters of a doubleheader baseball game between the Chicago White Sox and Detroit Tigers at Chicago's Comiskey Park had arranged a between-game event with Steve Dahl, the DJ of a popular local rock radio station, titled Disco Demolition, wherein a large box filled with disco albums donated for this purpose by attendees would come to be blown up with explosives by Dahl and his crew, who'd cultivated a comedy persona around the gimmick of being purist rock and roll fans at war with the disco trend in popular culture. Modern popular culture remembers the disco moment and its subsequent crack-up as a kind of weird fever dream, but the whole sweep of it was much more about a point where this specific music and dance genre came to be identified as the symbolic nexus point for a very rapid push into the cultural mainstream of aesthetic elements borrowed from gay and black urban metropolitan subcultures that crashed hard against a backlash supercharged by the confluence of the AIDS crisis and economic downturn and the rise of Reaganism and the moral majority. We mostly remember the disco sucks blowback now as a culture collectively getting tired of tacky clothes and the cheesy mainstream side of the disco genre because it's easier than accepting the ensuing decade's cultural complicity in the homophobia, racism, and bordering on genocidal callous disregard of the HIV epidemic that were in reality inextricably bound to the general rightward tilt of late 70s, early 80s pop paradigm. Basically, once celebrities got big into the club scene, a streamlined, watered-down version of this musical experimentalism, generalized as disco, became a huge, mega-profitable fad as a way for the mainstream, read middle-class white people of America to nibble at the edges of the counterculture without feeling too kinky about it. A certain percentage of traditional rock radio stations and analog musicians felt financially stung by the trend and publicly lashed out about it, which got conflated with media perception of disco as a gay, liberal, foreign, black, Latin, etc. genre invading white spaces, and the general conservative backlash wave that was about to land in the 80s. At the actual event, even before Dahl got to blow up his box, it turned out too many fans had shown up and there were too many records. Depending on who you ask, this was in part because some had brought not only disco albums but also R&B, soul music by black and Latino artists in general, or rock albums by artists who'd express leftist politics, so people had started throwing them from the stands like frisbees during the first game. When the explosion actually went off during the changeover, it was larger than expected and waves of fans decided to rush the field and began trashing and looting the stadium, ultimately causing the second game to be forfeited as riot police had to be called into the stadium. The whole debacle made national news, international news really, characterized in Rolling Stone magazine as your paranoid fantasy about where the ethnic cleansing of rock radio could ultimately lead, and later compared to a Nazi book burning by legendary music producer and chic guitarist Nile Rodgers. To this day, the Disco Demolition riots and the ugly attitudes associated with it are often framed as a flashpoint that not only killed a music genre, but perhaps helped kickstart a hard-right backlash cultural domino effect that would effectively include the rise of the moral majority and Reaganism in America, a framing that continues to this day. When the White Sox this past year decided to mark the anniversary last month by selling cheeky commemorative t-shirts and having Steve Dahl throw out the first pitch, the event was met with public outrage in some quarters due to the organization not only making no mention of how the history had come to be viewed by some, but also hosting the commemoration early during Pride Month. Now, to be clear, that definitely feels like no small amount of insensitivity at play, but I myself have always been a bit skeptical of the idea that Disco Demolition itself was a catalyst without which the ensuing backlash culture of the early 80s would either have not happened at all or taken a significantly different form. To be a bit on the tenuous side, that isn't to say that rowdy, angry, overly invested in the wrong way fans of music or sports or comics or whatever aren't a bad thing or part of the problem or deserve some kind of absolution for their part in these matters, but sometimes I do think that because they're the most visible, easily contextualized, and reachable on the ground part of negative cultural waves, there's a temptation to make them the focus of the blame rather than the bigger, harder to grasp and therefore fight forces that actually drive these things. It's important to remember that the majority of fandom itself is a reactive, reflective thing. It responds to the world much more than it shapes it, so instead of looking back on things like Disco Demolition or any of our current embarrassments as the starting point of bad happenings to come, maybe it's better to try and see them as evidence of bad happenings that are already underway, while there's still time for us to recognize it and do something about it.
That was a mistake.
So I'm old enough to have really been born in the immediate aftermath of the disco craze. as a cultural trend, having been immediately dead and buried at the moment that I was born, and then having grown up in the aftermath of, oh god, disco, no one ever liked that, and then reaching adulthood in the moment of, actually no, that wasn't so bad, and people actually liked it, that was a thing that you were gaslit about, and now having come through a couple different reappraisals of that.
Did you know that disco record sales were up 400% for the year ending 1976? If these trends continue, hey!
Some of you, I would imagine most of my audience at this point, my audience seems to, at least according to analytics, tends to trend about a decade or so younger than me, which is probably for the best. I would be really annoyed to think that I am only talking to people who are directly of my own cohort. Not that I don't appreciate people of my own cohort, but I don't like the idea of speaking only to an echo chamber or not having anything to say to either those of an older generation who I would admire or a younger generation that might be able to learn something or that I might be able to learn something from. I would hate to think that I'm even the good version of yet another middle-aged YouTuber only speaking to other middle-aged people on YouTube. Just the thought of doing that kind of grumpy talk radio bullshit. Just, yeah, no. Pass. But to digress, the disco moment in American culture, in popular culture, and we're speaking very much of American culture, so global audiences forgive an American talking about Americans, but this is an American phenomenon, is what we sometimes call an inflection point of mainstream culture, where what had been an element of subculture and alternative culture saturate the undercurrent enough that they break through into mainstream culture, and mainstream culture begins trying them on aspects of subcultures. And you hit a point where either a certain amount of that becomes mainstream culture, or mainstream culture snaps back against it and says, oh, we actually dipped our toe in the pool and it turned out the water was hot, or we don't actually like this, etc., etc. And in American popular culture, the 1970s was essentially that for mainstream middle-class white culture, trying on the aspects of the counterculture, drug culture, the quote-unquote hippie-yippie culture, non-white culture, etc., that had prevailed throughout the 1960s as elements of the rising youth culture that had come into focus as the baby boomers supplanted the previous generation of their parents as the top market demographic in the economy.
I used to be with it, but then they changed what it was. Now what I'm with isn't it, and what's it seems weird and scary to me. It'll happen to you.
That's a lot of jargon all at once, but this is an unscripted thing. I'm not going to be putting up as many graphics or just moving pretty fast. There's a great movie called The Limey, where a character played by Peter Fonda, who's supposed to be this burned out guy who's sold out, who was a cool guy in the 60s and is now a music executive, who's a villain type character in the movie. He's describing someone asking him what the 60s are like, and it's very meta because it's Peter Fonda. And he explains that it was really only 1966 and a little bit of 67 for him.
It must have been a time, huh? A golden moment.
Have you ever dreamed about a place you never really recalled being to before? A place that maybe only exists in your imagination? Someplace far away, half remembered when you wake up. When you were there, though, you knew the language. You knew your way around. That was the 60s. No, it wasn't that either. It was just 66 and early 67. That's all it was.
And what he's talking about is the 1960s as people think of it, you know, this cool haze of great music and kids dancing in the mud and protests and the great moment when things seemed possible, that it was really only about a year and a half period. And that's probably true of the way actual generational moments really happen. When people talk about what were the 60s about, well, there was so much else happening in history. There was real protests, real things happening, real important stuff. But the t-shirt slogan, you know, sex, drugs, rock and roll, fight the power, all of that did carry on well beyond in a superficial, hey, these are fun things to do, well past that point. To the point where it curdles into just toys to play with. And there's a school of thought that says that the 1970s is by and large the point where the toys of the 60s cross over directly from the youth culture and the alternative culture into something that suburban American culture can play with. Because when we say mainstream culture in America, let's be very honest here, we're talking about middle-class white people. You know, for you younger folks, pop culture reference point, this is where That 70s Show, the sitcom, is basically about this. The point where all of the fun, dangerous, angry stuff of protests and drugs and people dying in Vietnam and dancing in the mud at Woodstock and, you know, drug overdose and whatnot, when all of that transitions away from that into kids in the Midwestern suburbs smoking dope in the basement. That's literally the 70s.
Okay, I thought about it. And I'm going to the disco. Just on the off chance that they might mix up a little rock and roll, man.
Yeah. Well, I have something to say. I went to the mall today, and I bought a pair of new shoes.
So outside the suburbs, in the urban white middle class, the metropolitan white middle class, you have the disco scene, where you have ostensibly straight white people dipping their toes into the discotheque culture to try it on for size. Hey, let's put on leisure suits and be a little kinky and go to gay minority clubs, or had previously been a little bit gay, mostly minority music dance clubs, and you see what that's like. Dance around to this, you know, heavy synth, backbeat music, disco music, the genre evolves now into house music and whatnot. The Bob and Carol, Ted and Alice moment of, hey, maybe mainstream suburban couples should swing, translated into music and dance culture. Take some elaborate drugs, loosen up, see what happens. And this becomes a trend, the music gets popular, and suddenly this is everywhere. Disco was a music trend, but also a fashion and culture trend, growing out of, but not totally even directly associated with disco as a music genre popular in minority, majority, and or gay and queer music clubs, which in turn became shorthand for the fashion and dance, dating, and lifestyle aesthetic connected to those clubs and that whole scene. Just in a way to describe a lifestyle aesthetic without saying it all at once.
Everybody disco dancing! Lots of fun, good time for all! I'm having very good time!
And suddenly, this is everywhere. It's on the radio, there's disco remixes of popular songs. There's a disco remix of the Star Wars theme. Disco versions of popular rock songs. Kiss, who made, you know, Disco Sucks their anthem after this, records a disco song, which is fucking hilarious. Disco Duck is a song. There's disco cartoons. It's a culture trend. Now this reaches a pop culture crescendo, as it often does, in a very dumb way, despite the movie not being bad, really. In a movie called Saturday Night Fever, which comes out in 1977. Yes, same year as Star Wars, and it's weird that those two don't get, like, mentioned in the same context very often, even though they're similar, if disparate, phenomenons. So Saturday Night Fever, which I imagine at this point most people really only know as a couple of scenes that are not even the whole movie of John Travolta dancing to pretty good music and John Travolta strutting down the street to the iconic song. Like, I don't know when is the last time that even people who think of this as a good movie have watched the whole movie, and most of you probably know of the movie but haven't watched it. If you're younger than even 35, have you watched all of Saturday Night Fever? You probably should. It's a decent movie. It's iconic. Do people know that this is fake? It's a good movie based on complete bullshit. What happened is a British rock journalist had basically gotten assigned to do a story about, hey, we've heard through the grapevine, because back then no Twitter, no social media, basically, you know, you would still get stories of, hey, a guy heard a thing, fly across the pond and look into this crazy story. Sounded like a good pop culture story, and it was a good pop culture story when you hear about it. The cool new thing for young, horny straight guys who want to get laid is not to hang out at the malt shop or the sock hop, as it was maybe 10 years ago, but to go to what were previously mostly black, mostly, maybe a little queer, dance clubs in the cities, dressed in leisure suits and slick hair and whatnot, and dance to what was, even then recently, mostly thought of as gay music. Isn't that unusual? These, working class, garage mechanic kids getting dressed up in leisure suits and dancing to disco music. And isn't that an interesting story, that is now the cool thing? Wouldn't that be a funny story? Sure it is. So he goes to investigate this story and supposedly can't get into these clubs because they have bouncers and whatnot, and just says, oh no, hey, this is scary, and instead decides, yeah, but I'm still getting paid to do this, so he makes up a guy and writes a fictional-ass story about just a guy who is, again, can't stress this enough, a made-up fucking guy who is like the quintessential young, scrappy, working-class Italian guy who also loves disco music and dancing and wins competitions and whatnot. He figures, actually, this is bullshit. They're not going to run this. This is crap.
How do you know someone didn't just make it up?
What? You mean just lie? You really think someone would do that?
They run it. It becomes popular. He gets the screenplay rights, and this becomes a huge hit as the movie Saturday Night Fever, which of course is a hit because it's a pretty good movie. John Travolta's a big star, he can dance good, and the music is great, so huge hit. And we don't find out that he made all of this shit up until 20 years later. But in real time, back when it first comes out, huge hit. Disco fever literally takes over the world for a couple years, takes over at least US popular culture for a couple years, and right around this same time, mainstream culture kind of decides that it's had enough of the disco thing.
I don't want to play with you anymore.
Regardless of what else you think of it, this whole moment stops having a moment. Rock radio kind of decides, no, we're sick of running disco music. A lot of our audience changes the channel when they hear a rhythmic beat and synthetic strings in the background. We don't like running the covers of songs with disco tracks in them. People get on edge about it. There's not a lot of genre crossover here. And there is also, of course, a lot of homophobia, racism baked into it as well. Like, it becomes a thing where I hate all this gay stuff, I hate black music and slang and fashion being everywhere, I hate the party drug culture, I hate current thing, can all be couched as I hate disco. And it's not even the music, just this nebulous concept of hating this cultural moment. And I want to stress that, too, that this did not mean that everyone who hated disco music, everyone who hated disco culture was hateful, but it became a really easy way for hateful, bigoted culture to smuggle itself in under the guise of something that was just hating a dumb pop culture trend. Does that sound familiar?
Princess Peach!
Yeah.
Give it her pants!
Yeah.
Total mainstream Hollywood girl boss voice.
Yeah.
Barbie is like the deformed, mutated rage child of Captain Marvel, Ghostbusters 2016, and She-Hulk.
Bo Peep from Toy Story 4, Ray Skywalker.
An assault on not just Ken, but all men.
Preachy, man-hating, and a zombie lie.
Current version of this, of course, is much more tiresome because it doesn't even need a genre to attach itself to. Like, there's no woke genre. Diversity is not a genre. So everything is more upfront about it. Someone who says, I hate wokeness, basically gives me, I don't like empathy. I hate forced diversity. Well, what the fuck is forced diversity? That's not a real thing. That's an imagined thing. Force of anything like that is in the eye of the beholder. So whenever someone says, I hate forced diversity, it means they perceive it as being forced. That's not to say that you have to like or dislike something, but like forced basically means this is diverse in a way that I do not like. And it feels very much of the same kind. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're like an outright super racist guy, but it means you should think about yourself. Maybe there was like a word beginning with a P that you should investigate or check of some sort. But that's what it's similar to.
We're not gonna make it, are we? People, I mean.
And in the 70s, this culminates, at least in moments. I don't think it's the only moment or the biggest one. You're calling it the night disco died was a little much. But as a thing you can point to, yeah, Disco Demolition was a moment to point to and say, yeah, that was probably a sign of bad stuff happening. Now, of course, the other X factor in all of this, which is so omnipresent it almost makes the rest of it unspoken, is in the midst of all this, coming right up behind all of it and then overwhelming all of it, is that you had the AIDS crisis happen. So not only did gay, urban, progressive culture dial itself back publicly, you had millions of people sick and dying as well, and that can't be minimized. Like, who knows what happens culturally to a moment in pop culture where the toe dipping in of mainstream middle-class white culture pulls back and says, oh, hey, you know, that version of maybe that's a little much for us was not immediately countered by literal plague. Who knows what else would have happened? Because that is a 1-2 knockout punch. And it almost feels, not even almost feels, it does feel grotesquely minimizing to even conflate or connect the two. Because it's not like, oh no, if only records hadn't been blown up somehow magically through karmic fate, this horrible disease epidemic would not have also risen alongside. This was a terrifying coincidence of events, and we'll just never know what might have been had the cultural forces that were pushed back against by the, oh, we don't like this in the form of disco moment, been able to regroup. Were they not doing triage and self-protection against a plague epidemic that the rest of culture was busy actively trying to ignore, if not exacerbate?
This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
And meanwhile, on the culture side, it was erasure happening. Erasure. Because for a moment, even outside of the large but still somewhat niche phenomenon that was the disco thing, late 70s pop culture was, for lack of other terminology, very queer, very diverse, and then the 80s mainstream pop culture was very white and also very undercover about how diverse and how, again, for lack of other terminology, very queer the preceding culture had been. You had mainstream rock acts, David Bowie, Mick Jagger, Queen, right there in the name of the band, very openly flouting gender norms, bisexuality, didn't put it all the way in the closet, but dialed it back into other forms. Kind of went, you know, pull it back, pull it back, pull it back. Kiss took the makeup off. Not that Kiss would ever be comfortable calling themselves part of, like, the queer era of 70s rock, but, like, Kiss taking the makeup off was probably part and parcel to the, no, rock can't even be a little bit queer now. So then elements of this had to become very undercover about it, filtered out in other ways. So that's where you see, like, glam metal, hair metal. There's elements of it peeking back out. Rob Halford famously bringing the studded leather bar look to metal, and noting that a lot of younger metal fans just did not even grasp that that's what that was. Dee Snider and Twisted Sister, enough said. Now, the 90s whiplash about this again, at least on racial lines. 90s pop culture is resurgently black in the way that 80s pop culture was resurgently white, particularly in music and fashion.
Black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm blacker than black, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm blacker than black, and I'm black, y'all.
But the fact that it had to resurge at all was telling, and it was part of this. And that erasure of how black and how queer 70s culture was part of the disco sucks backlash, basically. And I don't think that that can be realistically denied. And again, it's not about whether you like this fucking music. I'm not a giant fan of this music. Hating or not hating the music was a stand-in for people for hating a cultural trend. And a less subtle, mask-off version of that is what I see in this anti-wokeness thing now. this meaningless word, the appropriation of what at one point was a proper description of something woke, diverse, whatever, is now a way to brand anything that is non-right-wing, non-conservative, traditional American, basically non-supportive of the Trump sucker agenda, whatever, as a way to brand that as the enemy and a thing to be against in culture war space is the similarity that I see between anti-wokeness and disco sucks.
Disco sucks! You don't like the village people? They're not gonna shoot us down our throats! We rock and rollers will resist, and we will triumph!
But we have to keep pushing, is the idea that women are victims in the United States. They're part of the victim coalition here in the United States, and you have to hear it from She-Hulk.
It's not going to be woke. There's no more woke in this country.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
In the same way that wokeness has nothing to do with anything real, Disco Sucks had nothing to do with disco music, other than as a safe, coded, cowardly way to be, I'm not a racist, I'm not a sexist, I'm not anti-gay, but way to be against people, groups, general concepts associated with a nickname for a kind of music or a buzzword for some vague political concept. And good God, I hope that that makes some sense, to the degree that anything about this very stupid cultural moment can make any sense. I hope I'm making it make sense. Because the fact that this feels so familiar to me in this moment sucks. Because the disco implosion and Disco Sucks, whatnot, lasted a while. And it was successful. And if you needed another bullseye reason this had to at least be initially 2 parts, this would basically be it. We're at about the 40-minute mark of the full picture here, and this right here is pretty much the Bob finally gets to the fucking point part. Like, the history is important, and I hope everyone found it interesting, entertaining, etc., but the real part I wanted to hammer home here, that I thought needed all that goddamn context, your mileage may vary, probably a bit of an ego trip now that I think about it, is the rest of this right here, because I feel like something even my crusty-ass generation had a really tough time coming to grips with is that the version of pop culture history and also history that we received when it came to cultural improvement and social revolution was very skewed by the boomer memory of 20th century history being the narrative, and that narrative being very self-congratulatory even while being self-critical, and also very incomplete when we received it, and that kind of left us unprepared to deal with a lot of what happened as we got older. That narrative being basically history began in the 1950s, which was bad because conformity, but then we boomers invented being teenagers, and we got angry about Nam and did women's liberation and civil rights, and the guy had a dream which cured racism, we're pretty sure, and then several other things happened, and yeah, mistakes were made, but then black president and gay weddings, you're welcome, so basically progress is a line that goes diagonally up forever at varying speeds, right? Right? And no, obviously not. Like, I'm not a pessimist or a doomer. In fact, I do think there actually is some basic history truism to the concept of the arc of history bending towards freedom, etc., but it's definitely not a straight, clean arc. Sometimes the good guys lose, badly. Sometimes progress gets its ass kicked. Sometimes the Library of Alexandria burns. Sometimes the believers beat the thinkers. Sometimes the bad guys tear down the good things just because they can, and the good guys have to build things back from scratch, and it sucks. And as shitty as that is to hear, I think it's worse to deprive people of knowing that that can happen, because then they don't know what to do when it happens. And worse than that, they might think they can't overcome it because nobody ever told them that these battles have been fought back from and overcome before. That, yes, seeing what felt like big strides forward in acceptance and progress for this or that cause get pushed back or turned against hurts, but it's not unprecedented. Society doesn't move forward on a straight upward trajectory. It gets dragged up uneven steps, kicking and screaming like a disobedient, bratty fucking child that doesn't want to wash up before dinner, and sometimes it pulls free and falls back down the steps or drags you down with it, and you have to pull it back up again. And that sucks. That's a sucky fight to fight, but it is a fight that's been fought before. Other people have in fact come back from this kind of loss. and that means you can too. Not that it was a planned thing, but to the degree that this was a successful culture flip, an erasure of a moment in culture where American pop culture was trending in a more diverse direction and then folded back in on itself aggressively against the rapidity of a certain amount of change, lasted a while. And I am someone who grew up in the era of the post-Disco Sucks implosion. I was born in 1981 and grew up in the very, hey, it's morning again in America, let's get back to a very safe, comfortable, implicitly white suburban vision of things under Reaganism, under, hey, we went too far, everyone fucked too much, everyone rock and rolled too much, everyone did a bit too much blow, everyone had a bit too much fun, let's be less of that now. And as a child growing up in that, it did not really occur or come through to me until a little bit later just how much was lost to get the seeming safety and actual banality in which I had grown up. I did not get to know how many people suffered and were harmed in order to, build the relative cushion of comfort in which I grew up in, and the fact that it wasn't actually that comfortable. And that a lot of the things that I grew up in, most of the good music and good art and cool stuff, were actually things that were built by the weirdos and the freaks and the cool guys who were purged before I got here. Sesame Street and the Muppets and all that were made by a bunch of hippies who were fucking hated and were being shoved out of their jobs and defunded by the Reagan administration. All of the ass-kicking rock and rollers and musicians of the 60s and whatnot that my parents loved, wrote the books of rock and roll and whatnot, they were hated by the government that came into power by the time I was a young kid. And yes, fine, I loved a bunch of, cool cartoons and whatnot that I got to grow up with because they deregulated a bunch of TV stuff. And okay, thank you, Ronald Reagan. I got to have Transformers on TV. I'm not sure it was worth invading Iran-Contra or whatnot. I'm not sure that's like the trade-off. So before somebody brings that up, fuck you.
Just remember, there's a thin line between being a hero and being a memory.
But it's also worth remembering in these moments of seeing culture change. And when I say culture change, I'm talking about the way mainstream culture adopts or chooses not to adopt broad cultural shifts. The mainstream culture picked up and put down the disco moment like a toy that it was sort of interested in and then discarded because it only ever cared about it as a bauble that it was sort of shiny and interesting and said, oh, hey, look at this new weird kind of music and these new different people that we haven't really paid attention for, but seem to be, spending a little bit of money. And the rich people in the suburbs suddenly seem to be sort of interested in this new form of sex, drugs, and rock and roll because we've maxed out the value proposition in the original sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So, okay, let's dwell on this for a while and make a kitschy, less good version of this, perhaps about a duck to put on the radio and sell a little bit more. Okay. And as soon as it was clear that there was only a certain amount of money to be made in this, they not only stopped, but turned against it and said, no, this is actually bad, and we're going back and we're going to rebrand rock radio as classic rock, and we're only going to play guitar rock by white guys now. And we're going to pretend that Eric Clapton invented anything. And I've always been a proponent of the idea that, well, people should be suspicious of rainbow washing, rainbow capitalism, whatever. It's also okay to enjoy it when it gets here because, hey, it means that right now you've won a certain amount of victory because, to a certain extent, you are seen as the target profitable thing, and that's good. That means that you have a certain amount of power to pull on, but it can be fleeting. And it can go away, and corporations are never going to be your friend. friends. And they don't see you as a friend, they see you as dollars. And the component to taking advantage of that when it's there means keeping your guard up when you see it starting to go away. It doesn't mean that you have to be a sourpuss about it when you see like the display at fucking Walmart and say, oh hey, a pride towel, that makes me feel marginally accepted in the world, if it does. It just means don't let it cloud your judgment, I guess. I don't know that I, as a straight person, get to have a judgment about that one way or another. But if I did, it would probably sound like that.
The most glorious rainbow ever.
Oh, tell me on it.
Just say the word and they are yours.
Because you don't know when stuff like that's going to go away. You don't know when the popular culture is going to decide, you know what, we don't need to pretend to be your friend anymore. We think that we need to make the assholes feel good about themselves now instead. For some reason. And if that sounds a little doomy, I don't want to sound doomy. One, I don't think it's my business to sound doomy. I don't think it's my business to sound doomy as someone who is not going to be as affected by any of this as some others. And I don't do false hope, but I also don't do unrealistic doom.
Tonight at 11.
Doom! And what I can say is that remembering what I can and knowing what I know of the history of this, I don't know that the kind of erasure that happened of the real history of popular culture from the disco implosion is possible in this quote-unquote anti-woke moment, if there is indeed that kind of moment, simply because of the internet age.
Internet age?
And I am not someone who is an evangelist of, oh, the internet will save us because it stores information and because it's the global town squares. I am the most cynical person about this bullshit machine that is the internet. Very little good that it was supposed to do has been done, and most of the predictions about it have been false. But what it has allowed is connection, and for it to be very difficult to forget many things. And I don't know what the attempted erasure of what recent pop culture has been versus what the so-called anti-woke movement wants future pop culture to look like. I don't know that that kind of undoing is possible, or what it looks like now. After the disco implosion into the 1980s, it very much was possible to basically erase how diverse, how queer, how whatever you want to call the late 70s into the early 80s popular culture was. It wasn't just in a handful of art house films that only a few people in New York and LA saw. There was an episode of All in the Family, which, yes, highly politicized show, but also the most popular fucking show on TV. One of Archie Bunker's friends, Archie's buddy, the whole plot of the episode was that Meathead, Rob Reiner's character, was convinced that Archie's buddy was gay. And Archie was sure that he wasn't, and the payoff to the episode was the guy just going, you know, Archie, he's right.
Oh, Steve, you're going to want to bust him wide open when I tell you this. I don't know where he gets these brainstorms, but he thinks that you're the... I can't even say it, you Steve.
He's right, Arch.
Huh?
Right.
There was a transgender character on The Jeffersons. And again, a late 70s show, but like it was a storyline that happened. It was handled decently. The Love Boat, a 70s show that ran for a decade. The episode in question was in the 80s, but this was a 70s show, had a transgender storyline.
Excuse me, sir, what do you mean by these kinds of people?
You know. Different.
What do you mean by different? She is the same person.
Oh, come on, Gopher, really?
She is. Except that she probably has more guts than both you and I combined. I mean, do you have any idea what she probably had to go through before she even reached the decision she did? The strings of doctors and the tests that you have to take and who knows what else? Not to mention the pure physical and emotional pain of the whole thing. This takes courage.
You really sound as if you admire her.
I do.
That scene is from an episode that first aired in 1982. The Love Boat itself began airing in 1977. It was family-friendly Saturday night ABC programming. Mildly corny comfort TV for older viewers not out on the town mostly. Imagine that dialogue on a network drama now. That All in the Family episode, that was from 1971. Modern media is a landscape of cowards in many respects. There was a moment of several years where there were frequent gay characters in movies, transgender characters in movies. They were not called transgender characters back then, and a lot of the language around it was not what we would call great today, but they existed. From the late 70s to the early 80s, you saw highly politicized stories about black characters, Latino characters. Go back and watch any random episode of urban set television sitcoms, dramas, cop shows, whatever. Not all of them are going to be perfect. A lot of them are probably going to offend modern sensibilities. Compare them to how safe popular culture became into the early 80s. The erasure moment didn't really last either, by the way. Well into the mid to late 80s, culture swung back, pivoted back. I'm not a fan of pendulum narratives again, because sometimes things just change.
The truth lies somewhere in between.
Point is, there was a moment where popular culture was very much one way, and the slate tried to wipe itself because, to an extent, mainstream middle-class America thought it had had enough. And it kind of worked. For a short time, but it kind of worked. We really did, in the early to mid-80s, dial ourselves back to a version of the 50s in at least popular culture. I don't know that you can actually do that now. I think that there's people that want to try. I don't think they can. There was a whole book, even there's a famous book by Susan Flutie called Backlash, about the fact that even in outside of popular culture, in actual office culture, in entertainment culture, pop culture, there was an active attempt to undo the strides of feminism, to undo women in the workplace, to undo this, and how it translated from both real life work culture and also movies and television depictions of professional women, some of which were not thought of as anti-feminist, but that she felt were.
We now return to busy business lady whose life is missing something, but she doesn't realize it because she's so busy with business.
I've got a lunch meeting and then a meeting after lunch. After that...
Over the next 90 minutes, I'd like to show you that all your problems can be solved by my penis.
This was a controversial book at the time that was a bestseller and widely read. A lot of it's very dated, but you can find this book and read it. It's very interesting as a time capsule of the moment. The thing is, even back then, this was, pre-internet, you could simply just no longer have things on TV, no longer have things on bookshelves, no longer talk about subjects on the news, and it would go away unless you were in university or in academia and had access to what we would now call a content library. Now, Internet Archive, YouTube, web in general, I don't know that that kind of erasure can really be as strong. It's a different fight.
Instead of one big shot controlling all the media, now there's 1,000 freaks xeroxing their worthless opinions.
I won't tell you that that's why you should have hope, but I think it's a reason to have hope. That it is much harder to erase you if you are someone who is part of a community or a culture or a mindset, that these fucking people who are on this anti-wokeness kick, if you're someone or part of a community that they would like to see erased, or even if you're just a fan of types of entertainment, genres of music, art, that would be part of this kind of erasure, it was not ultimately able to be fully erased before. And the tools to prevent that erasure are much more in your hands now than they used to be. And if there's a reason to have hope now, I think that that's that. I think that that would be it. That would be the reason. I'm Bob, and I don't know if that's the big picture this time, but I hope it is a coherent picture. Good luck out there.